Hey friends, welcome back. I'm Ash Leatherwood, your friendly neighborhood apologist, and we're here back with another interview. And with me is my friend Dr. Josh Taylor, who's a professional farmer. He founded Do Good Farms, is the head farmer for Four Roots. He just finished his doctorate in apologetics. His doctoral project was a class called God's Fingerprints in Nature. He founded Vine Apologetics, as you can kind of see in his background, and he has been married for 24 years and is a father of two daughters. So super stoked for a conversation we're going to have. It's going to be super fun and sciencey. It's just going to be really interesting. It's something that I'm personally really passionate about and interested in. So super excited to talk about intelligent design with him. And yeah, just happy to have you on, Dr. Josh Taylor.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So kind of to dive in, just want to talk about like more of your story. Like you started out getting into farming. So what was that like? Why did you kind of lean into farming? What was that initial passion for that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Very long answer. I'll try to make that as short as possible. So the short of it is my wife and I 20-ish years ago just began to be really burdened for the least of these, as scripture refers to people that are hungry and thirsty and broken, enslaved, down and out, oppressed. As we began to discover that there's more slavery today than there ever has been in history, and that thousands of children are dying every single day because they lack access to basic nutrition and things like that. And so we wanted to do something about that, and the little part that we could anyway. And so as we kind of laid out our budget and figured out where we could give more of our resources and our time, very quickly realized didn't have a ton of wiggle room in our spending. And so decided, hey, why don't we grow some of our own food so we can spend less on groceries and dining out and things like that. And very quickly realized that in Florida, farming and gardening is a disaster. But between the heat and the weeds and the sandy soil and the pests and everything, super challenging to grow plants here. And so after some initial discouragement, continued to do research on farming practices and farming methods. There's a lot out there. There's a lot of opinions, if you will. And the more that we learned about some of the farming practices that we're doing right now, like permaculture and food forestry, which is essentially the same thing, aquaponics, and how that can work together with traditional soil gardening, began to realize that it has implications for global hunger and not just our family. So that kind of started the journey, and we've been on it ever since.
That's awesome. And kind of going back to the beginning, we kind of talked about how you founded Do Good Farms. So very curious to hear more about that initial vision, which sounds like you already touched on a little bit, and really just how Do Good Farms developed and what it's kind of turned into.
Yeah, so we founded the nonprofit to end hunger and malnutrition, but instead of just shipping boxes of rice and beans over and over again, we wanted to equip and empower people to actually provide for themselves sustainably. And so with hunger specifically, if I've got, let's say, $10,000 and I want to help people that are hungry, I can go and buy $10,000 worth of food. I can hand that out. People can eat. Then they're going to be hungry again, and I'm out of money. And so what if we take that $10,000 and invest it in sustainable farming methods that can continue to produce food forever? And so we design all of our farms to accomplish two main purposes. Number one, we want to be able to harvest food 365 days a year. Secondly, once a farm is up and running, it should produce food forever as long as it's maintained. And so to accomplish that, which we'll talk a little bit about tonight, is is really just harnessing nature's ecosystems that God has designed and using them to grow food, because the rainforest and the jungles have been producing plants for thousands of years without any farmer help, without any inputs and fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides and things like that. Lakes have been growing lily pads and grasses and things like that for a long time without any farmer help. And so how do we harness those ecosystems and use them to grow food? And probably the main key to sustainability is closing waste loops, where waste from one thing becomes input to something else. And nature is brilliant at doing that very thing. So when leaves fall to the ground, that's a dead form of energy, if you will. And there's a whole biome of insects and bacteria and beneficial fungus and things like that will convert that dead form of energy into a form that can be consumed by living plants and animals. And so that's really kind of the bottom line, is using those ecosystems, but using them to grow food. So.
That's awesome, man. I love that, Josh. And just as you said that, like, made me think that old saying, like, if you give a fish to a man, like, you feed him for a day, but if you teach him to fish, you can feed him for his life. It's just cool saying, like, well, it's like good-hearted, like, you want to send them food, but like, you want to do something more than that. You want to raise up these farms to give more long-lasting effects. So that's really cool. And just hearing you describe even how these farms work, understand the processes, and really just trying to replicate good designs that already exist in nature, trying to harness just those effects and processes to, like you said, provide food year-round, which is really incredible. So I'm already seeing some of the connections to intelligent design, and I'm excited for what we're going to get into. But I guess on that note, from being already established in the farming world and raising up these do-good farms, how did you enter your doctorate studying apologetics, and kind of what led you to do that?
Yeah, not really related to this necessarily. I did not grow up in a Christian home. Didn't hear the gospel until I was in college. I grew up in Louisiana, very heavy Catholic presence there. You think about things like the New Orleans Saints, Mardi Gras. Louisiana is the only state in the country with parishes rather than counties because of the Catholic church system there. And so moved to Atlanta to go to Georgia Tech in '92, and that's when I first heard the gospel. And I was I was quite the skeptic, just because of my experience with church culture and some negative experiences with that. And so I met a gentleman by the name of Carl, who went around to the freshman dorms, and he would bring in lasagna and salad and breadsticks and iced tea for $2 a student, which was a fantastic break from ramen noodles for poor college kids. And he would use that as a springboard to talk about the things of God. And I just pummeled him with questions, just like question after question after question. And he was very patient and took time with me over a number of weeks and months to really press through into those questions with me, and was able to answer the questions and knew scripture like it was his name. Really incredible man of God. And so that's when I surrendered my life to Christ at that point. And so because of that experience, that lit a fire in me to tell everybody. I'm like, how in the world did I live 18 years of my life and never hear this incredible news? It literally is like the cure for cancer, but even better and bigger. And so became a bit of a zealous evangelist, and did some different trainings and went door to door and did some open air preaching and did some stuff in LA and other things. And the more that I did that, the more that I encountered hard questions that I didn't have answers to. And so that's sent me to go find the answers to those questions. And so my experience with coming to Jesus and that experience of not having answers to really good, hard questions pressed me into apologetics so that I could find the answers that I needed.
That's awesome. Just hearing your story and background and how you came to faith. Wow, that's an awesome story. I didn't know that. But I guess so now that you've been in the study of apologetics, you've had experience sharing your faith, and you also have this paired expertise and experience in farming and botany and just ecosystems in general and that sciencey stuff. What's it look like connecting these two passions of yours?
Yeah, so in the farming world, again, this was a little bit of an accidental, although you and I know that things like this are not accidents, a little bit of an accidental, unintentional connection there. So what I discovered in studying farming, studying gardening, and how we can do this in a sustainable way, where we need to be able to set up a farm in the middle of the bush in Africa, and where people can't go and buy fertilizers and pesticides from Home Depot and Lowe's, or get, there's not a farm supply place, out there. And so how do we farm in a way where they'll be able to produce their own fertilizers? And so the more that I began to study that, the more that I realized how brilliant nature is in doing that. And the more that I studied how brilliant nature is, the more I realized, wow, this is intentional, and God's design is just extraordinary. And so there are few things that I've encountered in life that highlight the brilliance of God's design in the things that have been made, as Paul said in Romans chapter 1, than farming.
That's awesome. I'm excited to hear more like examples of that. But I guess one broad question, was there anything that surprised you as you started studying ecosystems and farming and just all the processes and checks and balances? Is there anything that really surprised you going in and as you got kind of deep into it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I feel like I'm surprised every single day as I continue to learn, and we'll be learning for the rest of my life. But there's all kinds of relatively new discoveries when you think about the history of farming and the scientific revolution and the history of invention and the things that have happened over the last few centuries. Like literally things are being discovered in the last 5 to 10 years in farming that are changing the way that we think about farming and growing plants. And so just to give you a little bit of a background on that. So Industrial Revolution and Scientific Revolution were kind of happening in the 1800s. And you've got guys like Louis Pasteur, as an example, who discovered that these little things that we can't see, which we now know are bacteria, are what causes milk and beer to spoil. And so at the same time, simultaneously, better tools were being invented, microscopes and things like that. And so they're able to see a little bit smaller, if you will. And so as they discovered that these little things that are invisible to the naked eye are causing beer and milk to spoil, there was this kind of fork in the road, and the scientific world kind of went down this direction of these little things cause things to spoil, so let's kill them. And if we kill them, then the milk doesn't spoil, and so we're good, right? So that was kind of this concerted effort at that point, conscious decision that sent us down this path of kill everything, sanitize, if you will. In the process, what we didn't realize is that we were also killing a lot of really incredible beneficial microorganisms. And so truly, literally in the last 5 to 10 years, things are being discovered about this soil microbiome and soil ecology that are just mind-blowing. And what we are discovering is, instead of feeding the plants nutrients with fertilizers, what we actually are doing is feeding the microbes that feed the plants. And so an example of this is in the last 10 years, what is known as the rhizophagy cycle was discovered. And rhizo is the area around the roots of the plants. And so the rhizophagy means like to eat or consume. And so literally plants are eating bacteria in the soil, just discovered in the last 10 years. Incredible stuff. And so these bacteria enter the roots. The plant shoots it with an oxidate that breaks down the bacteria to some extent and is able to use some of the minerals that make up the bacteria, but it doesn't kill it. Sends it back out, shoots it back out the roots for the bacteria to kind of rebuild itself, and then it comes back in again. And so that's why it's called the rhizophagy cycle. This happens over and over and over again. And so they've been able to, Dr. James White has been able to, it was the one who discovered that, and been able to capture that in photography using microscopy, and it's just extraordinary, cool stuff.
Wow, that sounds incredible. Still like within the past 10 years.
Yeah.
So I can see how like this would have implications into farming practices and just understanding the whole process. But I guess kind of taking that conversation just a step further, what do we know about ecosystems and these processes on this minuscule level, just from the science that's been happening in the past 10 years? What's happening that most people may not know about?
Yeah, there's a lot of people that still may not even know some of these things. And the reason why I say that, not to say that I'm better, or that there are other people that are better or anything like that, but there's an economy around this, big economy, right? And so when it comes to fertilizers and chemicals and inputs into the soil, I mean, there's a lot of money behind those things, right? And so as an example, the Haber-Bosch process was invented by Haber and Bosch, and I think it was 1918. They won a Nobel Prize for that. Which was used a process that uses incredible pressure and heat to harvest atmospheric nitrogen. So nitrogen is one of the number one nutrients that plants need. 80%, roughly, I'm rounding, 80% of the atmosphere that we're breathing right now, the air you're breathing right now, is nitrogen. And so they developed this process, but it uses an enormous amount of energy, very high carbon footprint. And so it revolutionized the farming world. But more and more experts are now realizing that that's not sustainable long term. Again, high carbon footprint. And so we've got to figure out ways to do things differently. Well, there are bacteria that's all naturally occurring that are called nitrogen fixing bacteria that have a symbiotic relationship with plants. And they are able to harvest, they have special enzymes that are able to harvest atmospheric nitrogen and create and input nitrogen into the soil and feed the plants that it has a symbiotic relationship with, and even the plants that are around it as well. And so again, nature had this ecosystem long before the Haber-Bosch process. And yet we're realizing that if we can create an environment that is helpful to these beneficial microorganisms, then we can use nature to create our own fertilizers. And literally we could talk about this for hours. But just another example. So bacteria and fungi have enzymes that are able to break down minerals in the soil. And so a previous kind of viewpoint that's still out there in industrial ag spaces is that the soil, if you will, is primarily made up of sands, silts, and clays, which are different sized particles. And if you have the right mix of that, then you get the right amount of drainage, but it retains the right amount of water and all of those things. Well, those sands, silts, and clays have minerals locked up in them that can feed the plants, right? And so there have been studies done where they've taken soil samples from all over the planet, and every single soil sample that they've taken had enough nutrients locked into those minerals to feed plants for thousands of years. And so if we can put the right healthy soil microbiome in there, then it's literally like a fertilizer factory in the soil where these bacteria and fungi are able to unlock those nutrients using special enzymes that are, again, all God's design, right? But then there are other healthy, good organisms in the soil that consume those bacteria and fungi, and then they release nutrients that become available to the plants as well. And so it's just, again, it's mind-blowing stuff, and that's not even scratching the surface.
That's incredible. And I'm a big picture person, so I'm just kind of imagining that, like, for this greatest output, like, there are balances within an ecosystem, and that some of these solutions that we're looking for, you're saying that, like, we can actually find that they already exist and have been operating, like, in nature, independent of people engaging with them for so long. So I'm curious, what is research into, you mentioned like rainforests and jungles, and finding these bacteria and fungi and these different things, what does that look like, and how has that informed your farming practices, specifically with the Do Good Farms, and seeing just the year-round output that you've gotten to have with that?
Yeah, so as an example, if I'm understanding your question correctly, there are in mature forests, the level of these nutrients are astonishingly lower than what typical recommendations are for a fertilizer program for a farm. Astonishingly lower. So if you were to just test the soil in a mature forest, you're not going to see these high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and all of these things in there. And the reason why is because there is a living ecosystem in the soil that is constantly creating those things for the plants and for the trees. And so plants literally, this is crazy, they talk to these other organisms, right? And so if you're going to talk to something, there's got to be a common language that you both speak, which you didn't, which neither of those organisms invented, if you will. And so there's this common language, which I would say is invented, created by God to allow these things to talk to each other using signaling molecules and things like that, where plants are literally like this conductor of an extraordinary symphony, where they are able to, for example, like fungal networks and mycorrhizal fungi and things like that are able to, the plant is able to say, hey, I need these minerals, I need this water, I need this pest control, I need this disease control, and the fungi will go out and bring those things in. And if you look at these fungal networks in the soil, they literally look like brain neural networks. And so it's like this vast communication system that is extraordinary and really exciting to study. And so that has informed our farming practices, because when you saturate the soil with chemical fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides and things like that, it destroys all of those good organisms. And so what ends up happening is that the soil really just becomes a holding medium. There's no nutritional value in it whatsoever. That living ecosystem is not there anymore. And so so it's really kind of created this downward spiral in the farming world, because as you destroy those organisms, what tends to survive because they're able to reproduce really rapidly is bacteria. Well, when you have a dirt, if you will, it's not even soil anymore. If you've got dirt that has high levels of bacteria in it, that's going to select for weeds, which is going to increase your weed pressure, which means you're going to have to spray it even more, which kills even more. And so it's this downward spiral that you can never get out of. But if you can do some things which now are becoming well understood, then you can replenish that living ecosystem in the soil. And again, you're literally putting a fertilizer factory in the soil, and these different organisms are able to outcompete the harmful organisms. So like as an example, things like E. coli, which there's been a lot of news stories over the years where, romaine lettuce has to be recalled because salmonella somehow got in the irrigation system and these plants are sprayed with salmonella. And when you have the right microbiome in the soil and around the plants and on the plants, the good guys will outcompete the bad guys like E. coli and salmonella. And so they're not able to survive. Now, it's not that these bad organisms aren't able to survive in those environments, which are primarily aerobic, oxygen-rich environments. It's that the good guys have an enzyme that's more efficient at breaking down food and creating food for themselves than the bad guys. And so the bottom line is, when you have good aerobic environments for these organisms, the good guys are going to outcompete the bad guys. And you've got healthy soil, healthy food. And again, it's the way God designed it, which actually works.
That's amazing. Just how much stuff goes on inside soil. Like, it's a small little world in there. Like, it's a whole ecosystem. It's just cool hearing how many different just parts interacting, just like converse together, like you said. That's incredible. So how has it been like understanding, like, there's the world in the soil, and like understanding what it looks like in these mature forests, like you've been talking about, and trying to replicate that in a farm that you're installing? Is it difficult to kind of remake that process, the ecosystem within that environment?
No, it's actually not at all. And so there's some very clearly defined practices, including things like composting and recycling nutrients, where if you put the right foods in the soil, the good guys will have a food source, and so they'll grow and they'll multiply, and you'll increase their population. And so again, if you put the right food sources, have aerobic environments, use things like nitrogen fixing crops, and then what's called no-till farming as well. This is relatively new practice, although it's an ancient practice, but it is relatively new in large industrial ag spaces, if you will, where we recognize now that when you run a rototiller through the soil, it's like a hurricane coming through the house and destroys that protected environment for all of these good guys. So tilling creates compaction. It creates these hard layers that plant roots can't go down through, so they're not able to send tap roots deeper into the soil to find aquifers, and so they are dependent entirely upon inputs. And so now again, it creates this dependence, kind of like drug addiction kind of thing, where it's like you destroy the good stuff, and so your body's just constantly like, give me, I need more. And so that's kind of what's happening in the soil as well.
That makes sense. And yeah, just hearing that makes me think that like something that is designed not only is going to function remarkably well, but you're going to be able to understand it and potentially even like replicate it, which is cool that you've been able to see the design and do the same thing in these farms. I feel like that might point to design, that it makes sense and that you can put it together again.
Right.
That putting it together again takes intelligence. So that's really cool to hear that. But kind of on that note, in your field, given all of this, do you think that intelligent design makes sense of these observations? What do you think is the connection between all this study and the theory of intelligent design?
Yeah, so intelligent design is a broad field of study. And some of the things that I think point to an intelligent designer in the soil ecology just screams intelligent design. And so if you think about a concept like what Michael Behe discovered in the late 90s, or I should say coined, he didn't necessarily invent anything, but he recognized that there are highly complex structures in living organisms, the simplest of living organisms, that could not have come about by random chance. And he called that irreducible complexity. Sorry, I just had a brain fart there. He called that irreducible complexity, where there are things like the bacterial flagellum, for example, that are that look like an outboard motor, and it's because it is an outboard motor, which we know intuitively is designed, right? And so the other thing that he did in his research, discovered in his research, is that these things could not have come about by chance. And so the scientific world, of course, didn't like that explanation, and so they said, well, here's what could have happened. And so they kind of rebutted with this co-option theory, which says that, oh, these organisms were able to use similar parts from other things, but like in a lot of bacterial flagellum, for example, there are 40 parts, 10 of which are that are similar to other structures that are used in other systems, but 30 of those 40 are completely unique to that system. And so what happens is a very simple way to think about irreducible complexity is something like a mousetrap, where you know that every single part of that thing has to be there or the thing doesn't function. So for example, if you were somehow able to put a tail on a bacteria that is not able to spin, that it becomes a deficit to the organism, which means natural selection it's going to be invisible to natural selection, because natural selection is survival of the fittest, something that allows this organism to survive and is able to replicate itself. Then it continues to add on to those benefits. Then eventually you have this more advanced organism, right? That's kind of the idea behind natural selection. Well, what happens is all of these things, the parts, if they were just there by themselves, they would actually be a deficit, not a help to the organism. So they wouldn't survive, which means those traits would not be passed on, if that makes sense. And so in the same way, so that's the idea behind irreducible complexity. In the same way, you have these highly complex organisms, bacteria and fungi and beneficial insects and nematodes and other microorganisms that are massively complex. And so in and of themselves, they are very complex. But what we are now discovering is that they are all dependent on each other. So as an example, all complex organisms depend on things like bacteria for producing nitrogen, atmospheric, that process that we talked about of taking atmospheric nitrogen and allowing other organisms, complex organisms, to access the nitrogen, which is a key component in DNA and amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, which are the building blocks of all of life. We are entirely dependent on bacteria, 100%. If we didn't have bacteria, you and I would not be alive right now. So all of these complex organisms are dependent on each other, which is like irreducible complexity on steroids. And again, the fact that they're able to talk to each other using complex communication systems with feedback and adjustments and all of these things, it's really astounding.
That's incredible. And it's like, first, like you said, like the irreducible complexity we find in individual situations where it's like, for something to be alive, it must function. And so it must already function from the start. And hearing that incredible example of like, okay, how does something come into existence already functioning? But then, like you said, putting that on steroids, where these different things must exist simultaneously and already function and be able to communicate with each other in these very complex ways. So it's kind of like, I don't know what the word you use for that, but kind of like a irreducible complexity, like within the ecosystem and the interrelationships there. And so that's just incredible, seeing the design. So given that, do you think that intelligent design is a compelling theory, given these observations?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a compelling theory. And I would say that it's not a theory. Intelligent design uses well-established scientific principles that are already in play in the scientific world, and uses those principles to draw conclusions
Mm.
About those things. So a great example is the SETI project, SETI. Movie Contact with Jodie Foster was made in 98, 99, I think it was, about this program. And the acronym stands for Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And what they are looking for, it's all these satellites pointing out into space all over the world that are just listening out there. And what are they listening for? They're listening for information. Because we know that information equals intelligence. This is an established scientific principle. These scientific programs are using this basic principle to look for intelligence, right? So information we know equals intelligence. We know that messages only come from minds. And so when we see bacteria talking to fungi and other organisms and creating signaling molecules that are able to go out and say, hey, bring this, bring this, bring this. That communication is an information-rich system. DNA is the most information-rich system in the world. And I'll give you just a mind-blowing example to think about. Right now, 3% roughly, maybe higher now, but roughly 3% of the entire world's energy is being consumed by data storage centers. So you've got organizations like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter or X now, and Google and the U.S., Russia, China, all of it. Like Facebook, as an example, has 14 data centers with many thousands of square feet of storage space for all of these data centers around the world, right? Well, if scientists in Harvard and other places right now are actually looking at the DNA storage mechanism, the way that DNA stores information as a viable tool to store the world's data, if we could actually get that down and get it down efficiently, you could store the entire world's data, all of it, Facebook, Twitter, in the size of a human being, the size of a small bathroom, right? All of it, US, Russia, China, all of the world's information, period, which is currently being stored in thousands upon thousands of square feet in these massive warehouses that are consuming enormous amounts of energy. If we could use DNA storage mechanism, you could put it all in the size of a bathroom. It's remarkable. That is information. And we know scientific principle, we know that information comes from intelligence, which is what SETI is all about. So we're just using basic, well-known scientific principles and using those to draw scientific conclusions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I love that. I've got to admit to our viewers, like, intelligent design is one of my favorite subjects in apologetics. I love it so much. I think it's one of the most compelling evidences for an intelligent creator for me. So I think it's one of the greatest masterpieces in creation, like you said, like seeing the information, seeing the structure, seeing the processes. I think that intuitively we know that these processes do come from intelligence. And like, if we have any skeptics watching them, I say, what about examples of bad design? And oftentimes we might find things that we can't explain or don't make sense to us. And sometimes we find an answer, sometimes we don't. But the fact is that those examples are dwarfed by the remarkable design and functionality that we find everywhere else. And so for the Christian or theist, examples of bad design are much less of a problem than the remarkable design and processes that we find everywhere else for the atheist, who has to basically believe that a factory would result in an explosion in a Home Depot. They can't even explain where the Home Depot came from, much less the factory and all the processes functioning just right from this explosion. So I absolutely love that, and that's just so fascinating for me. I'm curious, kind of what's the future of intelligent design, given what's happened in just the past 10 years that you've been talking about? Does soil ecology and farming have more to give to the theory of intelligent design? What do you think is held for us in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually working right now on creating bringing a group of people together that would be kind of like a think tank, soil ecology, to do research on how potentially having an intelligent design framework and mindset would actually improve farming and food production in the world. And so we'll be able to do experiments and understand more about how plants talk to this soil microbiome and how these organisms talk to each other and work together rather than against each other. They're not competing, they're actually helping one another. And so Yeah, I think soil ecology is going to be a focal point of intelligent design in the next 10 to 20 years, frankly. And so I'm really excited about the potential and what the future holds in that. I'm excited to get to participate in that story in a very small way. And so yeah, I'm looking forward to what the next couple of decades hold in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't wait to hear more and just more discoveries and just more of those processes that we get to learn about. So super stoked for that. Kind of similar question with a different twist on it. What do you think the view of intelligent design contributes to farming and agricultural practices and understanding?
Yeah, just really the short answer is more of kind of what we've talked about already. We better understand how these organisms work together, how they talk to each other, then we can do a better job of creating the right environment for those beneficial organisms to thrive. And once we give them the right atmosphere and the right systems to work in, then they're able to do their job, which means the plants are going to be healthier, which means the food's going to be healthier. We recognize, as an example, so I'm currently, you mentioned the Four Roots Farm Project, which is a farm campus that we're developing in the city of Orlando, Florida, which is where I live. It's going to function a lot like a science center for the city of Orlando. And one of the components of this, big emphasis on education and research and inspiring the next generation of farmers and inspiring change in our food system. But one component to that is going to be the Culinary Health Institute, which will do research on food as medicine. And so in the farm world, in the food production world, there has been different scientific disciplines that have kind of operated in silos historically. So you've got people that study the soil and soil health, and you've got people that study plants and plant health, and then you've got people that study in medicine how, if you eat the right fruits and vegetables, then humans will be healthier. And so what we are doing at Four Roots is creating a proverbial table for all of these disciplines to sit at and talk together and make the connections between the health of the soil microbiome and human health, because the human gut is dependent on a microbiome as well. And so more and more research is now pointing to the connection between the health of the soil microbiome and the health of the human gut microbiome, which translates into health for us in particular. And so in the same way, when we can create the right environment in our bodies for the beneficials to outcompete the negative ones, then the bad guys, if you will, then we're able to unlock more of the nutrients from the foods that we're eating. The foods that we'll be eating will be healthier. So these fruits and vegetables that we'll be consuming will be healthier because they have a fertilizer factory in the soil that's able to unlock more plant available, bioavailable nutrients for them to consume. And so it's interesting when you think about agriculture as an example. There are a lot of things when we think about human design and invention and the scientific revolution and scientific advancements. There's a number of things where humans have invented things where their natural counterpart, the human invention, doesn't come close to the brilliance of the natural counterpart. So the eyeball, as an example, you think about the phrase, the pictures don't do it justice, right? When you take a picture of a sunset and it's like, oh man, it's just not the same as just being there, and like, wow, what our eyeball is able to do. Cameras, as advanced as they are not able to accomplish what the human eye is able to accomplish. And so you have that contrast, and like airplanes are like a 747, like even like Air Force One is not as complex as a Cardinal, right? It's just remarkable how brilliant and complex a little bird is. And so it's unbelievable. But that contrast of human invention versus natural design, I'm not sure of an example on the planet that is such a stark contrast as it is in agriculture. And here's what I mean by that. That whole Louis Pasteur thing that we talked about earlier, right? Where we said, let's kill the bad guys, kill all the little things that we can't see with our own eyes. Well, what we've done over the last 200 years of farming is literally convert soil into dirt, which means it's not living. It doesn't have the nutrient density
Mhm.
once had a long time ago. And
Mhm.
for example, the UN has said that we have the world has less than 60 years left of good soil, and they've said it's 50 years in the United States, as an example, because our farming practices are literally destroying the
Yeah.
health of the soil, right? And so all of these scientific advancements over the last 200 years have been spent dealing with the symptoms of that fork in the road decision that we had that says kill all this stuff, which creates symptoms which we then have to go and fix, and more symptoms, and again it's that downward spiral. So that contrast of our scientific advancement versus the brilliance of God's design is on display massively in agriculture.
That's incredible. And just hearing the examples that you've already shared, like I'm blown away. I love just the impact of it. Like it's not just this head knowledge that we get to know about and marvel over, but seeing how you're talking about how it can be used to better society in so many ways, and that there's an actual really big change you can make in the future to prevent certain things from happening. So that's incredible. I can't help but see a connection between just farming and seeing just the beautiful order in creation to Genesis in the Garden of Eden, where God creates this garden that functions beautifully, but he also tells Adam to go and work the soil and to be involved in the process
Yeah.
and to work in the process. So I can't help but see the connection there to the farming you're doing. Understand just the beautiful process that God has already created, all these checks and balances, and just how wondrous it is, but also to be involved in it, to just enjoy just the wonder in the process. So I can't help but see that connection there. But that's really cool. So for our viewers who really just caught on to this, be like, wow, this is so cool. There's so much more here that they want to learn about. What are resources they can go to? Is there any particular book that you would suggest that they could pick up on intelligent design, farming, or any of these practices?
Yeah, so we do have some resources available on the Vine Apologetics website. You mentioned that earlier. So in my apologetics journey, in the class that I taught called God's Fingerprints in Nature, if you want to learn more about this, we'll go into more in depth in that class, which you can find at vineapologetics.com. And there's also a resources page on there with different books around intelligent design and apologetics and things like that from various ages and things like that. So there's a lot of great resources there. There's good resources in the organic farming world, although I will say that organic is one of those terms that has a lot varying definitions, varying practices within that field, if you will. And organic really is a government certification
Mm.
uh, that sort of allows them to kind of have their hand in the cookie jar, if you will. It says, hey, if you want to have this certification, then you have to meet these standards and pay us some money in order to have the organic certification. And so there are a lot of farms, especially small farms, that aren't able to. It doesn't make sense for them to get the organic certification, but they're using great practices. And so things like looking at forestry. So what we've talked about with these fungal networks is new in the industrial ag space, but it's been known for decades in forestry. So Suzanne Simard, there's actually some documentaries on Netflix. Intelligent Trees is a great one to look at. And then a lot of books around permaculture and things like that. People can learn more about these practices. Those aren't necessarily going to point to an intelligent designer per se, but you can make that connection. It's a very intuitive connection to say, wow, when we actually protect all these living beneficial organisms, things actually work.
Yeah.
Bottom line. And then when you take things like these concepts, these intelligent design concepts that we've looked at, like irreducible complexity, and you recognize how vastly complex these small microscopic organisms are, then you can begin to draw those conclusions between these organic practices, if you will, and intelligent design.
Awesome. So there you go, guys. Go and check out those resources. If they want to learn more about what you're doing with Do Good Farms and potentially support, is there somewhere they can do that?
Yeah, DoGoodFarm.org. We have a donate page there. If somebody wants to, follow more of the ongoing stories with Do Good Farm, we have a Facebook page, which is facebook.com/DoGoodFarm. So, for example, right now you'll see some pictures posted from a farm that we are installing in Burundi, Africa, which is a tiny little country in the center of the continent of Africa. Really excited about that project. It's for a school of about 200 deaf children that are in a boarding school. So this farm will grow food to feed those kids, but then also they'll be able to take extra to market and sell it and create a sustainable economic engine that'll help support the school that's out there. So very excited about projects like that.
That's awesome. So you guys see that this is incredible stuff. It's also going to help people around the world. So if you want to get involved with that, definitely check out those resources. But that's our conversation for you guys today. So I hope you enjoyed it, found it as interesting and just incredible as I did. If you want to see more interviews just like this, then stick around. We have a couple interesting ones coming up pretty soon on New Testament documents and stories of an atheist coming to be a Christian and several other interesting ones coming up. So stay tuned for that. But thank you for joining us, Dr. Josh Taylor, and maybe we'll have you back on at some point.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been fun.